The moment I opened my jewelry box, I knew my daughter had stolen something far more valuable than gold. I had just returned to my home in Columbus, Ohio, after spending 3 weeks in Florida caring for my older sister after her heart surgery. My suitcase was still beside the
Mom,
bed when I
I know
noticed
this
my
is
bedroom
hard to
drawer
hear, but
slightly open.
I sold the
Inside
jewelry.
the velvet box my mother had
needed the
given me
money.
50 years earlier sat empty. My wedding ring was gone. My mother's pearl necklace was gone. And the gold brooch she had once warned me never to lose had disappeared. When I asked my daughter Caroline where they were, she looked at me without a trace of guilt. "I sold them, Mom," she said quietly. "You weren't using them anyway." She had no idea that one of those pieces carried a secret my family had protected for generations. And by selling it, she changed both of our lives forever. If you've ever had someone you love make a decision that broke your heart, I'd truly like to hear your story. Please leave a comment and tell me how you would have reacted in my place. And if you're listening tonight, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your messages always remind me that none of us walk through these moments alone. If this story speaks to you, I hope you'll stay with me until the very end. My name is Lena Gomez, and by the time my daughter sold my jewelry, I was 68 years old and had already survived more heartbreak than I ever thought a person could carry. People often assume that when you reach your late 60s, life becomes quiet. They imagine peaceful mornings, warm cups of coffee, grandchildren visiting on weekends, and old women sitting comfortably in rocking chairs. My life had never looked like that. I spent 36 years teaching second grade in Columbus, Ohio. Children came and went through my classroom like seasons. Some of them became doctors, nurses, business owners, and teachers themselves. Every Christmas, a few would send cards. But after school hours, I was simply a wife and a mother. My husband, Robert Gomez, worked as an electrician. He was a patient man with rough hands and kind eyes. He never made a great deal of money, but he made our little house feel safe. We bought our home in 1987. It wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, a white front porch, a maple tree in the yard, a creaking staircase. But Robert used to tell me, "A house doesn't become valuable because of its price, Lena. It becomes valuable because of the memories inside." I believed him. When our daughter Caroline was born, Robert cried harder than I did. He adored her. He attended every school play, every soccer game, every piano recital. When she fell off her bicycle at age 8, he carried her inside as if she were made of glass. And when she graduated from college, he stood in the audience wiping tears from his eyes. Caroline was our entire world. Then cancer entered our lives. Robert was only 62. At first, he promised me he would beat it. Then he promised me he wasn't afraid. Finally, during his last week in the hospital, he held my hand and said something I still hear every night before I sleep. "Take care of yourself this time. Not Caroline, not the house, not anyone else. Yourself." I promised him. But I don't think I ever truly kept that promise. After Robert died, the silence inside our house became unbearable. The clock seemed louder. The refrigerator hummed constantly. Even the floorboards sounded lonely. Caroline was already married to David Bennett by then. They lived only 20 minutes away, but life had become busy for them. David owned a small construction company. Caroline worked for an insurance agency. Their schedules were full. At first, they visited every Sunday, then every other Sunday, eventually holidays. I told myself that this was normal. Children grow up. Parents become memories waiting in old houses. Still, I never complained. I had learned long ago that love cannot survive guilt. The jewelry box sat inside my bedroom dresser for almost 50 years. The box itself wasn't beautiful. Dark mahogany, velvet lining, a tiny brass lock. Most people would have looked inside and seen ordinary things. A pearl necklace, a gold bracelet, a diamond wedding ring, several brooches, a pair of earrings. Nothing particularly extraordinary, but every piece carried a life. My wedding ring was purchased by Robert 3 months before our wedding. He had worked extra shifts to afford it. The pearl necklace belonged to my mother. The bracelet was given to me after Caroline was born. The earrings came from my sister Margaret, and then there was the gold brooch. The brooch had always been different. My mother, Eleanor Brooks, kept it inside a small velvet pouch when I was a child. She rarely wore it. When I was 12 years old, I once asked her why. She looked at me very seriously. "Some things aren't meant to be shown," she said. Years later, when she became ill, she called me to her bedside. She handed me the brooch. It was shaped like a flower with tiny engraved leaves around the edges. Nothing about it appeared especially valuable, yet her voice trembled. "Lena, whatever happens in your life, don't lose this." I laughed softly. "It's only a brooch, Mom." She squeezed my hand. "No, one day it may save you." I remember thinking illness had made her confused. She never explained further. Several months later, she passed away. The brooch became simply another family keepsake. Or at least that was what I believed. Over the years, Caroline occasionally asked about the jewelry. "Mom, that necklace is beautiful." "Mom, Grandma's bracelet must be worth something." "Mom, have you ever had these appraised?" I always smiled. "They aren't for sale." She never argued, at least not then. After Robert died, I opened the jewelry box more often. Not because I wore the pieces. I simply needed to feel connected to the people I had lost. Some evenings I would sit quietly on my bed. I would hold my wedding ring, touch my mother's pearls, look at the brooch, and remember, people who have never experienced grief sometimes believe objects are meaningless. But objects become anchors. A ring becomes a marriage. A necklace becomes a mother's embrace. A brooch becomes a voice from the past. My older sister Margaret understood this. She once told me, "When enough people die, memories become your inheritance." Perhaps that is why I protected those pieces so carefully. The jewelry wasn't about money. It was about survival, about identity, about remembering who I had been before loss entered my life. A few weeks before I left for Florida, I opened the jewelry box one evening. The sunlight coming through my bedroom window landed directly on the gold brooch. For reasons I still cannot explain, I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. I remembered my mother's warning. One day, it may save you. At 68 years old, I almost laughed. Save me from what loneliness, old age grief. I placed it back into the velvet lining and locked the box. Then I put the key inside my bedside drawer. At the time, I believed I was protecting old memories. I had no idea that within a few weeks, my daughter would sell every piece inside that box. And I had absolutely no idea that my mother's strange warning spoken decades earlier was finally about to reveal its true meaning. 3 weeks before I discovered my empty jewelry box, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was my older sister, Margaret. Her voice sounded weak. "Lena," she said quietly, "I don't want to worry you, but the surgery didn't go as smoothly as they expected." Margaret lived in Sarasota, Florida, nearly 1,000 miles from my home in Columbus. At 72, she had always been the strong one between us. She had survived divorce, breast cancer, and raising 2 sons largely on her own. Hearing fear in her voice frightened me. "What do you need?" I asked. "I just don't want to recover alone." That was enough. Family had always mattered to me, even when life became complicated. Within 2 days, I had arranged for a substitute volunteer teacher at my church literacy program, packed a suitcase, and booked a flight to Florida. When I told Caroline, she seemed surprised. "For 3 weeks?" she asked. "Maybe longer if Margaret needs me." She glanced toward David before answering. "We can check on the house if you want." David immediately smiled. "Of course, Lena. We'll make sure everything stays fine." At the time, his kindness comforted me. Looking back now, I realize he answered much too quickly. The night before my flight, Caroline came over for dinner. She brought chicken soup and cornbread. David helped me carry my suitcase downstairs. They both seemed unusually attentive. "Leave us a spare key," Caroline said, "in case of emergencies." I hesitated, not because I distrusted my daughter, but because after Robert died, I had become protective of my privacy. Still, I handed her the key. "You don't need to come every day," I said. "We'll handle everything," David replied. Those words would later echo inside my head. We'll handle everything. The first week in Florida passed peacefully. Margaret was recovering slowly. Her small condominium overlooked a lake filled with ducks and white herons. Every morning, I made coffee while she rested in a recliner near the window. For the first time in years, I felt useful again. My sister and I spent hours talking about our childhood, about our parents, about Robert, about growing older. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we cried. At night, I called Caroline. The first few conversations felt normal. "How's Aunt Margaret? How was your flight? Did you remember your medication?" But after several days, something changed. The phone calls became shorter. Caroline seemed distracted. One evening, I asked, "Are you busy?" She answered quickly, "Just work." Another night, I suggested a video call. "My camera isn't working," she said. The following evening, she texted instead. "Busy tonight? Talk tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Margaret noticed it before I did. "Is everything okay with Caroline?" she asked. "Of course. You've checked your phone 6 times during breakfast." I smiled. "I'm just being a mother." But the truth was that uneasiness had started growing inside me. One afternoon, during my second week in Florida, my next-door neighbor Helen called. Helen had lived beside us for 20 years. She was 74, widowed, and wonderfully nosy. "Lena," she said, "I hope you don't mind me asking something." "What is it? Have Caroline and David been staying at your house?" I frowned. "No. Why?" "Oh, I've seen several cars there lately." My stomach tightened. "What kind of cars?" "I don't know. Different people. One pickup truck, a black SUV, some younger man." I tried to remain calm. "Maybe they're helping with repairs." "Maybe," Helen said. "I just thought you should know." After hanging up, I immediately called Caroline. She answered after several rings. "Mom." "Helen says people have been at the house." There was a pause. "Oh, David had some friends helping move furniture." "Move furniture. We wanted to clean the guest room." I didn't understand. "Why?" Another pause. "Just organizing." The explanation felt strange. My guest room hadn't changed in 15 years. Still, I told myself not to overreact. People imagine that betrayal always announces itself loudly. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives quietly. A delayed text, a short answer, a feeling in your stomach, a conversation that doesn't make sense. The following Sunday, Margaret and I sat outside watching rain move across the lake. She suddenly asked, "Have you ever noticed how children begin treating their parents differently once they believe their parents are old?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "They stop asking. They start deciding." Her words unsettled me. "Caroline isn't like that." Margaret nodded. "I hope not." That evening, I called my daughter again. David answered. "Lena, where's Caroline?" She's in the shower. I almost never spoke with David alone. He had always been polite, but there was something about him I could never fully understand. He smiled constantly, yet his eyes rarely smiled with him. Everything okay? I asked. Absolutely. How's your business? There was silence. Things are a little tight right now. I'm sorry to hear that. We'll figure it out. His voice sounded tense. Before I could ask more questions, he said Caroline would call me later. She never did. A few days afterward, I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. Margaret was snoring softly in the next room. I walked into the kitchen and made tea. For reasons I still cannot explain, I suddenly thought about my jewelry box, specifically my mother's brooch. I remembered her voice. Don't lose this. I almost laughed at myself, thousands of miles away, awake at 2 a.m, worrying about an old piece of jewelry. The next morning, I nearly called Caroline to ask her to check whether the jewelry box was still locked. But I stopped. I didn't want to sound foolish. After all, she was my daughter. I trusted her. Didn't I? During my final week in Florida, Margaret improved enough to walk around the neighborhood. She hugged me one evening. You can go home. I smiled. You trying to get rid of me? No, she said. I think you're worried about something. I didn't answer, because by then I was. The distance between Caroline and me had become impossible to ignore. Her calls lasted only minutes. Her texts felt cold. Whenever I mentioned coming home, she changed the subject. The night before my flight back to Ohio, I called her one final time. I'm landing around noon tomorrow. Okay? Would you like to come by? We'll see. We'll see. Not I miss you. Not I can't wait. Just we'll see. As I placed my phone on the nightstand, Margaret looked at me carefully. What is it? I don't know. She took my hand. Sometimes mothers know things before they have proof. The following morning, I boarded my flight. I thought I was returning home to my quiet house. I thought my biggest concern was unpacking my suitcase. I had no idea that by the next afternoon I would discover that the people I trusted most had already begun changing my life without my permission. And somewhere inside my house, hidden among the damage I had not yet seen, a small torn piece of paper was waiting for me. The flight from Sarasota to Columbus lasted less than 3 hours, but by the time I landed, I felt as if I had traveled much farther. I remember standing at the baggage carousel watching suitcases circle endlessly while a strange heaviness settled inside my chest. I told myself it was exhaustion. 3 weeks of helping Margaret recover had left me physically tired, but deep down, I knew something else was bothering me. Caroline had not come to pick me up. She had offered during our first week in Florida, but the night before my flight, she sent a short text. Sorry, Mom. Busy tomorrow. Hope Uber is okay. 20 years earlier, my daughter would have waited at the airport holding flowers. Now I carried my own luggage to the curb. The July air in Ohio felt warmer than usual. The Uber driver talked about baseball and road construction while I stared out the window. As we turned onto my street, I immediately noticed something strange. My front porch light was on. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I always turned it off before leaving. The driver unloaded my suitcase. I thanked him and walked toward the front door. The house smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. There was a strong scent of lemon cleaner. My living room pillows had been rearranged. The magazines on my coffee table were stacked neatly. A blanket that normally rested on my recliner had disappeared. Someone had cleaned. Or perhaps someone had searched. I couldn't explain why that thought entered my mind. I rolled my suitcase into the hallway. The silence inside the house felt uncomfortable. Usually coming home brought relief. This time, It felt like entering someone else's life. I walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator contained several containers of takeout food. I never bought takeout. There were unfamiliar coffee cups in the sink. David's favorite energy drink sat on the counter. My stomach tightened. Had they been staying here? Why I climbed the stairs slowly. The guest room door stood open. The bed had been used. Fresh sheets covered the mattress. Several boxes sat stacked in one corner. I frowned. I didn't remember those boxes. I walked toward my bedroom. The door was slightly open. That was unusual. I always closed it before leaving. The curtains had been pulled halfway open. Sunlight covered the bed. At first, nothing appeared wrong. Then I noticed my dresser drawer. It was open by perhaps 2 inches. A tiny detail. Most people would never have noticed. But I knew my own house. I never left drawers open. My breathing became shallow. I crossed the room, pulled the drawer farther, and there it was. The mahogany jewelry box. The brass lock hung loosely. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. I remember thinking perhaps I had forgotten to lock it. Perhaps Caroline had opened it looking for something. Perhaps there was an explanation. My fingers shook as I lifted the lid. Empty. The velvet compartments sat exposed, every space vacant. The ring Robert had given me, gone. My mother's pearls, gone. The bracelet, the earrings, the brooch, gone. I honestly cannot describe the sound that came out of me. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was something deeper. A sound made by someone who has suddenly lost time itself. I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands felt numb. For several minutes, I could not move. I kept staring into the empty box. Perhaps I had moved the jewelry. Perhaps another box existed. Perhaps I was confused. At 68 people begin questioning their own memory. I opened every drawer. The nightstands, the closet, the bathroom cabinets. Nothing. The jewelry had disappeared. Suddenly, I remembered the key. The small key that remained inside my bedside drawer. I opened the drawer. The key was gone. Someone had used it. My legs felt weak. I sat down again. And then anger finally arrived. Not fear, not confusion. Anger. Someone had entered my bedroom. Someone had opened my jewelry box. Someone had taken the most precious possessions I owned. I grabbed my phone and called Caroline. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, "Call me immediately." No response. I spent the next hour searching the house. That's when I began noticing additional details. A lamp had been moved. Several documents inside my office were out of place. My filing cabinet drawer wasn't fully closed. The linen closet had been reorganized. It felt as though someone had touched nearly everything. As I searched the bedroom floor near the dresser, I noticed something underneath the bed. A small, torn piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up. It looked like a receipt. Only half remained. Several words had been ripped away, but one line was still visible. Franklin Pawn and Gold. My heart stopped. I read it again. Franklin Pawn and Gold. A date from 2 weeks earlier. Part of a transaction number. Nothing else. Suddenly, my phone rang. Caroline. I answered immediately. "Mom, where are my jewelry pieces?" Silence. "Caroline." She exhaled. "I was going to talk to you." "When?" Another silence. "I'll come over." "No. Tell me now." Her voice sounded different, not frightened, not upset, almost tired. "We sold them." My entire body went cold. We, David and I could barely breathe. What do you mean you sold them? We needed money. My wedding ring. We needed help. My mother's jewelry. Mom. The brooch. She became quiet. All of it. I stood beside the bed, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers hurt. You sold my jewelry while I was caring for your aunt. Mom, please calm down. Calm down. Those 2 words hurt almost as much as the theft itself. When were you planning to tell me? We didn't know how. David and I looked around my bedroom. The open drawer. The empty box. The missing key. The broken trust. I want you here now. She hesitated. We'll come after David gets home. Will, again, always we, never I, never me. As if my daughter had slowly disappeared into her marriage. As if every decision belonged to someone else. After hanging up, I sat in my bedroom for nearly an hour. The afternoon sunlight slowly moved across the carpet. I picked up the empty jewelry box. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt truly alone. Not because my husband was gone, but because my daughter had crossed a line I never imagined possible. Eventually, I opened the box one more time. In the very bottom corner, caught beneath the velvet lining, I noticed a tiny indentation. The outline where my mother's brooch had rested for decades. I gently touched it, and suddenly I heard my mother's voice again. One day, it may save you. At that moment, I still believed I had lost only jewelry. I had no idea that somewhere beyond that pawn shop receipt, hidden inside the missing brooch, my mother had left behind something that would change everything. Caroline and David arrived at my house just after 6 o'clock that evening. The sun was beginning to set outside my living room window, painting the walls with orange light. I had spent the previous 4 hours sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at the torn pawn shop receipt. Franklin Pawn and Gold. The words seemed burned into my mind. I heard David's truck pull into the driveway. For a moment, I considered locking the front door. Not because I was afraid, because I was angry. But I opened it before they could knock. Caroline stood there, holding her purse against her chest. She looked tired, her blonde hair pulled back carelessly. David stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. Neither of them looked particularly upset. That hurt almost as much as the theft itself. "Mom," Caroline said quietly. I stepped aside. "Come in." Nobody spoke as we entered the living room. David sat first. Caroline remained standing. I noticed how she kept looking toward her husband before saying anything. Finally, I placed the empty jewelry box on the coffee table. "Tell me exactly what happened." Caroline swallowed. "We needed money." "For what?" David answered before she could. "My business has been struggling." I looked directly at him. "How much money?" He shifted in his seat. "A lot." "That isn't an answer." Caroline sat down. "The construction company lost several contracts. We fell behind." "On what?" I asked. "The mortgage. Credit cards. Business loans." Each answer seemed to come from Caroline while David remained strangely quiet. I looked at my daughter. "And your solution was to enter my bedroom and sell my jewelry." She immediately became defensive. "We thought you would understand." I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the sentence sounded unbelievable. "Understand what? That family helps family." I stared at her. "Family asks." She looked down. "We didn't think you'd agree." "No," I said. "I wouldn't have." David finally spoke. Lena, we intended to tell you. As soon as things improved. I picked up the empty jewelry box. You sold my wedding ring. His expression hardened slightly. You weren't wearing it. The room became very quiet. For several seconds, nobody moved. You think that's the point? I asked. It's jewelry. No. My voice shook. It was my marriage. Caroline looked uncomfortable. Mom, you're being emotional. I turned toward her. Your father bought that ring after working double shifts for 3 months. Tears began forming in my eyes. He held my hand, wearing that ring while he died. She looked away. And my mother's necklace, silence. The bracelet, nothing. The brooch. David frowned. What brooch? The question caught my attention. The gold flower brooch. Oh, Caroline said. That old thing. Old thing. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Don't lose this. I sat down slowly. How much did you receive? Caroline looked toward David again. He answered. About $12,000. I could hardly believe it. $12,000. 50 years of memories. A marriage. A mother. A family history. Sold for $12,000. Where is the money now? David sighed. Mostly gone. Gone. Business expenses. How long ago? 2 weeks. I felt as if the room itself had shifted. 2 weeks. They had sold my jewelry while I sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, while I worried about my sister, while I trusted them. I looked at Caroline. You had dinner with me before I left. She nodded. You helped me pack. She said nothing. You hugged me at the airport. Her eyes began filling with tears. Mom, you knew. Her voice broke. I didn't know what else to do. I leaned back against the sofa. For the first time, I truly saw how exhausted she looked. Dark circles under her eyes, tension in her face, hands shaking slightly. Something was wrong, but it still didn't excuse what they had done. David stood. We're under a lot of pressure. So you steal from your mother-in-law? His jaw tightened. We're family. No, I said. Family doesn't enter someone's bedroom with a key and empty a jewelry box. He crossed his arms. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I stared at him. Bigger? They were sitting in a drawer. My husband died wearing one of those rings. He shrugged slightly. That tiny movement changed something inside me. For years, I had tolerated David because Caroline loved him. He talked loudly. He made questionable financial decisions. He borrowed money frequently. But I had always tried to be supportive. At that moment, I saw something else. Entitlement. He genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. I turned back to Caroline. Whose idea was it? She didn't answer. Caroline. Her voice became almost a whisper. David said we could replace everything later. David immediately interrupted. Don't put this all on me. You said it, she replied. We both agreed. Because you said your mother wouldn't notice. The room froze. Caroline looked at him. He realized his mistake immediately. I felt cold. You thought I wouldn't notice. Neither answered. For several moments only the ticking clock could be heard. Finally, I stood up. Did you enter any other rooms? Caroline looked surprised. What? My office. My filing cabinet. My bedroom. David spoke quickly. We were cleaning. No. I looked directly at him. What were you looking for? His expression changed, only slightly, but enough. Caroline looked confused. What do you mean? I suddenly remembered the moved boxes, the papers, the drawers, the guest room, the filing cabinet, the questions about my house during previous years, the appraisals, the value of the property. A thought entered my mind that frightened me. Why were you in my office? David shook his head. We weren't. Helen saw strangers here. They were friends. What friends? Silence. Caroline looked at him. He looked away, and suddenly, for the very first time, I realized something. This wasn't simply about jewelry. The jewelry had been sold. The money had disappeared. Yet David still seemed tense, as if he needed something else, as if he had been searching for something. I picked up the torn pawn receipt. Where's the brooch now? Caroline wiped her eyes. The pawn shop. Are you sure? Yes, David spoke. I think so. I noticed the words. I think. Not I know. Not definitely. Something inside me tightened. The gold brooch had been my mother's greatest concern. The one item she had warned me never to lose. The one piece David couldn't even remember. And now it was gone. I looked at both of them. I want the name of the pawn shop. Caroline nodded. I'll give it to you. I want every receipt. She nodded again. And I want both of you to leave. Mom? No. My voice was calm now, almost frighteningly calm. I cannot look at either of you right now. Caroline began crying. David stood beside her. We'll fix this. I looked directly into his eyes. Can you bring my husband back? He said nothing. Can you bring my mother back? Silence. Then, no, David. You can't fix this. After they left, the house became quiet again. I sat alone in the darkness. For years, I had believed my daughter would always protect me. That night, I realized something painful. Children do not suddenly become strangers. They become strangers, one decision at a time. And somewhere beyond Franklin pawn and gold, my mother's missing brooch was waiting. I still didn't know why it mattered, but for the first time since opening the empty jewelry box, I felt certain of one thing. The story was much bigger than stolen jewelry, and David Bennett was hiding something. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty jewelry box sitting on my bed. I saw Robert's wedding ring disappearing into a stranger's hand. I heard my mother's voice repeating the same words she had spoken more than 30 years earlier. Don't lose this. At 6 o'clock the following morning, I gave up trying to sleep. The house felt cold. For the first time in decades, I didn't make coffee immediately. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the torn pawn receipt in front of me. Franklin pawn and gold. The address was only 20 minutes away. I picked up my car keys. By 8:30, I was standing outside the pawn shop. The building sat between a laundromat and a discount furniture store. A faded sign hung above the entrance. The parking lot contained only 2 cars. I suddenly felt embarrassed. Until that week, I had never entered a pawn shop. I imagined stolen televisions, broken tools, and desperate people selling their belongings. Now I was one of those people, or perhaps I was something worse. I was a mother trying to recover pieces of her own life. A bell rang as I opened the door. Glass cases lined the walls. Jewelry, watches, old guitars. Coins. A middle-aged man wearing reading glasses looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" I took a deep breath. "My daughter sold some jewelry here." His expression immediately became cautious. "When? About 2 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "Name?" "Caroline Bennett." He walked toward a computer. I stood silently studying the display cases. Every item had once belonged to somebody. Perhaps someone had sold an engagement ring, a grandfather's watch, a family heirloom, objects separated from memories. The man returned. "I remember her." My heart began beating faster. "She brought several pieces. Can I buy them back?" He hesitated. "Some have already been sold." The words struck me harder than I expected. "What about the wedding ring?" "Sold." "The pearls?" "Sold." "The bracelet?" "Sold." Each answer felt like another funeral. I gripped the counter. "And the gold brooch?" He looked up. "The flower-shaped one?" "Yes." His expression changed. "I remember that piece." "Where is it?" "It was purchased by a dealer." My stomach sank. "A dealer?" "He buys antique jewelry." "When?" "Last week." I felt my last bit of hope disappearing. Then he surprised me. "That was an unusual piece?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" He opened a folder behind the counter. "I've been doing this for almost 20 years. Most jewelry is ordinary. And this wasn't—" "No." My hands began shaking slightly. "Why?" He searched for a photograph. Finally, he placed it on the counter. There was my mother's brooch, the small gold flower, the delicate engraved leaves. Seeing it again nearly brought tears to my eyes. It felt heavier than it should. "Heavier," he nodded. "There seemed to be a second layer inside." My heartbeat became louder. "What are you saying?" He leaned forward. "I thought it might have a hidden compartment." Suddenly, I remembered my mother's face. "One day it may save you." For several seconds, I could not speak. "Did you open it?" "No." "Why not?" "I didn't want to damage it." My eyes remained fixed on the photograph. A hidden compartment. My mother had never mentioned one. Or perhaps she had. No, she had only warned me. "Don't lose it. One day, it may save you." The pawn shop owner continued. "The dealer was very interested." "Who is he?" "I probably shouldn't give out customer information." I reached into my purse and removed my driver's license. "My name is Lena Gomez." My voice trembled. "The brooch belonged to my mother. My daughter sold it without my permission. I need to find it." He studied me quietly. Perhaps he saw the exhaustion in my face. Perhaps he thought about his own family. After a moment, he sighed. "His name is Arthur Whitman." I immediately recognized the name. Arthur Whitman was a well-known antique collector from Chicago. He occasionally appeared in regional television programs about historical objects. "Do you have his number? I can give you his business card." My fingers shook as I accepted it. Arthur Whitman Antiques, Chicago, Illinois. I stared at the card. The answer had traveled hundreds of miles. Before leaving, I asked one final question. "How much did my daughter receive for the brooch?" The owner looked uncomfortable. "About $400. $400. My mother's final gift. $400. I thanked him and walked toward the door. Then he stopped me. "Mrs. Gomez." I turned. There was something else. "What?" "Your son-in-law came back." My body stiffened. "When?" "A few days after the sale." "Why?" He asked specifically about the brooch. I felt cold. What did he ask? He wanted to know if it had any documents. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Documents. My mother's words. The hidden compartment. David asking questions. The moved filing cabinet. The office. The boxes. The strangers at my house. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. This had never been about jewelry, at least not for David. I forced myself to remain calm. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know. Was he upset? The owner nodded. He seemed disappointed. I walked back to my car in a daze. Rain had begun falling. Small drops struck the windshield. I sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. Why would David ask about documents? How could he know about a hidden compartment if I didn't? Unless he had been searching for something. My thoughts returned to my office. The filing cabinets. The papers moved. The questions about the house. The real estate values. One memory suddenly surfaced. Nearly a year earlier, David had asked an odd question during Thanksgiving dinner. Have you ever updated your will? At the time, I thought he was being practical. Now the question felt entirely different. I drove home slowly. Halfway there, my phone rang. It was Caroline. I almost ignored it, but I answered. Mom? I went to the pawn shop. Silence. They told me David came back. Her breathing changed. What? He asked about documents. Another silence. Caroline, I didn't know. Didn't know what? Her voice became very quiet. A few weeks ago, David asked if your mother had ever hidden important papers. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. What did you tell him? Nothing. Why was he asking? I thought it was strange. I pulled my car to the side of the road. Rain continued falling outside. Caroline, she began crying. I swear I didn't know. Know what? He kept saying your house was worth more than you realized. The words settled heavily between us. Worth more. Not memories, not family. Value. Money. Property. Something was happening that I still didn't understand. But one thing had become clear. David had not simply sold my jewelry to pay bills. He had been searching for something. And somehow, the little gold brooch my mother had protected for decades stood at the center of it all. As I drove the rest of the way home, I reached into my purse and touched Arthur Whitman's business card. Chicago. The brooch? The hidden compartment? The documents? For the first time since opening the empty jewelry box, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt determination. Because whatever my mother had hidden inside that brooch, David Bennett had wanted it badly enough to search my house. And I intended to discover why. After returning from the pawn shop, I carried Arthur Whitman's business card into my kitchen and placed it beside my mother's old photograph. For a long time, I simply sat there. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows. The house seemed unusually quiet, almost as if it were waiting for something. Perhaps it was. I looked at the photograph. My mother, Eleanor Brooks, stood beside my father in front of their small house in Indiana. She was wearing a light-colored dress, and pinned to her collar was the gold brooch. For years, I had seen that photograph without noticing it. Now it felt different, as if my mother had been trying to leave me a message all along. I picked up the frame. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. Of course, photographs never answer. But memories sometimes do. That evening, I climbed into the attic for the first time in nearly 10 years. Robert had always organized our storage boxes. After he died, I avoided going upstairs because everything reminded me of him. The attic smelled of dust and old wood, Christmas decorations, baby clothes, photo albums, several cardboard boxes labeled in Robert's handwriting. One box simply read, Eleanor. My heart began beating faster. I carried it downstairs. Inside were old letters, several recipes, faded photographs, and my mother's Bible. At the bottom lay a small envelope. On the front, written in my mother's handwriting, were the words, For Lena. My hands trembled. I opened it carefully. Inside was only a single page. Lena. If you are reading this, it means I was never able to explain everything properly. There are things our family carried for many years, things I hoped would never matter again. Trust your instincts, protect yourself, and remember what I told you about the brooch. Love always, Mother. I read it 3 times. There was no explanation, no details, only more questions, things our family carried. What things protect yourself from whom I leaned back in my chair? Suddenly, I remembered something from childhood. I could not have been more than 9 years old. My mother and father had been arguing quietly in the kitchen. I had heard my father say, "You should tell her eventually." My mother answered, "No, not unless she needs to know." At the time, I never understood. Perhaps children hear far more than adults realize. The next morning, I called my sister Margaret. She answered immediately. "How are you?" I hesitated. "Margaret, do you remember Mom's brooch?" Silence, long silence. My stomach tightened. "Margaret, I wondered if you'd ask about it someday." I nearly dropped the phone. "What do you mean?" Her voice became quiet. "Mom talked to me before she died." "About the brooch?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because she told me not to." I sat down. "What exactly did she say?" Margaret took a deep breath. "She said that if you ever truly needed answers, the brooch would lead you to them." My entire body felt cold. "Answers about what?" "I don't know." "You never asked." "She was dying, Lena." Tears filled my eyes. "Did she say anything else?" "Only that the house mattered." The house, again. Everything seemed to return to the house. David's questions, the real estate value, the filing cabinets, the missing documents. My mother's warning, the hidden compartment. "What house?" I asked. "Our grandparents' property." I frowned. "What grandparents?" "Our mother's parents." I was confused. "They died before I was born." "I know." Margaret sounded uncertain. "Mom said there were papers." "What papers?" "I don't know." I pressed my hand against my forehead. For decades, I had believed my family history was ordinary. Now it suddenly felt incomplete. After hanging up, I walked through my house slowly. The living room, the dining room, Robert's workshop, the upstairs hallway, the old maple tree outside. David had wanted this house. But why? Yes, the neighborhood had become more valuable. Property prices had risen, but there had to be something else. I went into my office. Several files still seemed slightly out of place. One drawer had clearly been searched. Inside were insurance documents, tax returns, Robert's pension papers, old deeds. I noticed a folder labeled Property. I opened it. The current deed, mortgage documents, insurance records, everything appeared normal. Until I discovered something missing, a space, an empty space. I knew because I had organized these files myself. There had once been another envelope, brown, sealed. I couldn't remember what it contained, only that my mother had given it to me after Robert died. My breathing quickened. Had David taken it, or had I moved it years ago? That afternoon, Caroline arrived unexpectedly. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red. "Can I come in?" I hesitated before opening the door. She sat at the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she said, "I didn't know about the documents." "I believe you." She looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes." Tears immediately appeared. "But you still hate me." I looked down at my hands. "No." "What then?" "I'm hurt." She nodded slowly. "I know." For the first time in days, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't repeating David's explanations. She simply looked like my daughter. "I need to ask you something," I said. She wiped her eyes. "Okay." "Why did David ask about papers?" She stared at the table. "A few months ago, he started talking about your house." "What did he say?" "He thought it might be worth more than you realized." "Because of the neighborhood." She shook her head. "He kept saying older homes sometimes have complicated ownership records." I frowned. "Why would he think that?" "I don't know." She looked up. "He searched online." "What exactly?" She hesitated. "Your mother's family." My blood seemed to freeze. "My mother," he asked about Eleanor Brooks. "Why?" "I don't know." She began crying again. "I thought he was trying to help us financially." I suddenly saw how frightened she looked. Perhaps for the first time, Caroline herself was beginning to question her husband. "Did he ever mention the brooch?" She nodded. "Several times." "What did he say?" "He asked if your mother had hidden things." I felt a chill run through me. Hidden things. The compartment, the documents, the warning, the house. Everything was connected. After Caroline left, I returned to the attic. I searched every box, every envelope, every photograph. Hours passed. Near sunset, I found an old family album. Inside was a picture of my mother standing beside a house I had never seen. On the back, she had written, "Summer 1958. The Whitman property." Whitman. I stared at the name. Arthur Whitman, the antique collector in Chicago. Surely it was coincidence. It had to be, yet my hands would not stop shaking. I sat beside the attic window, watching darkness settle outside. For the first time in my life, I realized that my mother had been protecting something. Not jewelry, not money, something else. Something important enough to hide inside a gold brooch. And somehow, decades later, David Bennett had begun searching for it. As the evening shadows filled the attic, I carefully placed the photograph into my purse beside Arthur Whitman's business card. Chicago no longer felt like a distant city. It felt like the next answer. And somewhere between my mother's secrets and my daughter's betrayal, I was finally beginning to understand that the story of my family had never been as simple as I believed. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. For several moments, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what my life had looked like only a month earlier. My greatest concern had been Margaret's surgery. My biggest decision had been whether to repaint the kitchen. Now, I was sitting in the middle of secrets, missing documents, stolen jewelry, and a daughter I barely recognized. The photograph from the attic rested on my nightstand. Summer, 1958. The Whitman property. I read the words again. Whitman. The same name as Arthur Whitman in Chicago. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps not. I had stopped believing in coincidence. Around 9 o'clock, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, David stood alone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He wore jeans and a blue polo shirt. He looked tired, but there was something else in his face. Impatience, as though he had come to finish unfinished business. "Can I come in?" he asked. I considered saying no. Instead, I stepped aside. He entered the kitchen. I deliberately remained standing. "What do you want?" He folded his hands. "Caroline is upset." "She should be. You haven't answered her calls." "I spoke to her yesterday." He sighed. "Everything is falling apart." I almost laughed. My jewelry disappeared. My house was searched. My daughter lied to me. "And you think your problems are falling apart?" His jaw tightened. "We made a mistake." "No, you made several." He looked away. For the first time, I noticed how nervous he seemed. His foot moved constantly. His fingers tapped the table. He was not here to apologize. He wanted something. Finally, he said it. "Lena, we need to discuss the house." There it was. The house. Again. I crossed my arms. "What about it?" "You shouldn't live here alone." I stared at him. "This house is too much for one person." "I've managed for 10 years. He nodded. "But eventually, you'll need help." Eventually. Older people hear that word often. Eventually you should move. Eventually you need assistance. Eventually someone else should make decisions. I felt anger rising. "I'm 68, David, not 98. He forced a smile. "That's not what I meant." "Then tell me exactly what you meant." He hesitated. "The market is very good right now." I said nothing. "You could sell." "No. You haven't even heard the numbers." "No." He leaned forward. "The property alone is worth over 600,000. The number surprised me. Our neighborhood had certainly increased in value, but I had never considered selling. This isn't about money. It could help Caroline. There it was, again, always Caroline, always family, always sacrifice. I looked directly at him. "How much debt do you have?" He blinked. "What? How much?" "It's complicated." "No, it's a number." He looked away. "Things got difficult after COVID." "How much?" "About 200,000. My stomach dropped. $200,000. Suddenly, $12,000 in jewelry made much more sense. But it also made me realize something terrifying. $12,000 wouldn't solve anything, not even close. So why take the jewelry? Because the jewelry wasn't enough. He needed more, far more. "Did you search my office?" I asked. His eyes lifted immediately. "No." "You searched my files." "No." "You asked the pawn shop owner about documents." His face changed, only for a second, but I saw it, the fear. "Who told you that?" I ignored the question. "What documents were you looking for?" He stood up. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying. I wasn't looking for anything. My daughter says you've been researching my mother's family." His expression hardened. "Caroline talks too much." Something inside me became very still. For years I had tolerated David because he made my daughter happy. But suddenly, I realized something. He had stopped pretending. The polite son-in-law was disappearing. The real man was standing in my kitchen, and he was angry. "Your mother owned property once, didn't she?" he asked. My heart began beating faster. "What? Your mother's family had land?" "I don't know." "You never asked?" "No." He laughed quietly. "That's unbelievable." I stared at him. What exactly are you looking for? He walked toward the window. Old families hide things. David. Sometimes deeds. He turned. Mineral rights. Property claims. Inheritance. I felt cold. He knew far too much. How do you know these things? A friend. What friend? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. You should really think about selling. No. For Caroline. No. For your future. No. His voice became harder. Eventually, this house will belong to her anyway. I stepped closer. Only when I decide. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other. Then he said something I will never forget. You don't understand what you have. The room became silent. What does that mean? He looked away immediately. Nothing. No, I felt my voice rise. What does that mean? He shook his head. Forget it. He grabbed his keys. Before reaching the door, he turned back. If you care about Caroline, you'll help us. The front door closed behind him. I stood alone in the kitchen. My hands were shaking, not because of fear, because of certainty. David knew something. Perhaps not everything, but something. Something connected to my mother. Something connected to the house. Something connected to the missing documents. Around noon, Caroline called. Her voice sounded exhausted. Did David come over? Yes. She became quiet. What did he say? He wants me to sell my house. She began crying immediately. Oh, God. What? He asked me to convince you. When? Last night. I sat down. What exactly did he tell you? He said there could be old property records. What records? He wouldn't explain. Caroline. She hesitated. Last month he hired someone. I felt my breath stop. Who? A real estate investigator. I gripped the phone. What? He paid someone to research your family's history. My entire body felt numb. The attic photograph, the Whitman property, the hidden compartment, the pawn shop, the documents. Everything was becoming connected. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it mattered. Tears filled her voice. I thought he was trying to save our business. I closed my eyes. Perhaps she truly had believed him. Perhaps not. Either way, she was finally beginning to see what I had started seeing. That evening, I drove to Grace Sullivan's house. Grace had been my closest friend for 40 years. She had spent most of her life as an estate attorney before retiring. If anyone could help me understand what was happening, it was Grace. She opened the door wearing gardening gloves. Lena. I looked at her. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. She immediately pulled me inside. What happened? I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. The jewelry, the pawn shop, the hidden compartment, the missing documents, David, the house, the family photographs. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she removed her glasses. Lena, she said quietly. What? I think your son-in-law may be searching for something very specific. I felt my chest tighten. What? She folded her hands. I don't know yet. But I think we'd better find out before he does. And for the first time since my jewelry disappeared, I realized I was no longer facing this alone. Grace Sullivan had been my friend for 43 years. We met during our first week teaching at the same elementary school in Columbus. I taught second grade. She taught fourth grade while attending law school at night. Most people who knew Grace described her as kind. Only her opponents in court knew how dangerous she could become. After retiring as an estate attorney, she spent most of her time gardening, volunteering at the library, and reading mystery novels. But the moment I finished telling her everything, I saw the old attorney return. She removed her glasses, folded her hands, and began asking questions. Start with the documents. I don't know what documents David wanted. Exactly. What do you mean? She leaned forward. People don't search filing cabinets without a reason. I nodded. He asked the pawn shop owner about papers. She frowned. That bothers me. Why? Because nobody asks about hidden documents unless they believe documents exist. I looked down at the photograph from the attic. The Whitman property. My mother's handwriting. Grace studied it carefully. Have you ever heard this name before? No. Your mother never discussed family land. Never. Grace walked toward her office. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a legal pad. Let's make a timeline. For the next hour, we listed everything. David asking about wills, questions about the house, researching my mother, searching the office, the missing envelope, the brooch, the hidden compartment, the pawn shop, Arthur Whitman. When we finished, Grace stared at the list. He believes something belongs to you. I felt cold. What? I don't know. Money. Possibly. Property. Possibly. Why wouldn't my mother tell me? Grace became quiet. Sometimes parents protect their children by saying nothing. I thought about Eleanor. She had survived difficult years after my father died. She rarely spoke about her childhood, rarely discussed her parents. Perhaps there had always been secrets. Can we check property records? I asked. Grace smiled slightly. Now you're thinking like a lawyer. The next morning we drove downtown. The county records office occupied an old stone building I had passed hundreds of times without entering. The clerk helped us search family names. Brooks, Ellis, my grandparents, my mother. Nothing. After nearly an hour, Grace asked another question. What was your grandmother's maiden name? I thought carefully. Whitman. Grace looked at me. What? My grandmother's maiden name was Whitman. The room suddenly felt smaller. Whitman. Again. Arthur Whitman. The photograph. The property. Grace wrote the name down. The clerk searched again. This time several records appeared. Old records, very old. Property transfers, land divisions, tax filings. Most had occurred decades earlier. One document caught Grace's attention. Whitman Family Trust. Date 1961. She requested a copy. Unfortunately, the file was incomplete. Several pages were missing, but one sentence remained visible. Beneficiary protections shall remain attached to the property interests until transfer conditions are satisfied. Grace read it twice. What does that mean? I asked. She looked thoughtful. It means somebody established protections. For what? Possibly inheritance. My heart began beating faster. Could this involve my house? I don't know. But David may believe it does. As we left the building, Grace stopped beside her car. Lena. What? Did your mother ever mention trusts? No. Lawyers? No. Conditions? I shook my head. She looked troubled. I think your mother intentionally kept you uninformed. That evening I returned home emotionally exhausted. Caroline sat on my porch. She stood when she saw me. I've been waiting. I unlocked the front door. She followed me inside. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she handed me a small envelope. What's this? I found it. Where? In David's desk. I opened it carefully. Inside was a business card. Thomas Reed, Property Research Consultant. Beneath the name was a handwritten note. Whitman/Brooks Records. My hands began shaking. When did you find this? This morning. Did David know? No. She sat down. I think he's been lying to me. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her face. Not guilt. Fear. What exactly has he told you? He said your family might own something. What? He didn't know. Then why search? He thought there were old documents. I remembered the filing cabinets, the office, the missing envelope, the pawn shop, the brooch. Everything pointed in one direction. Caroline looked at me. Mom, I swear I didn't know. I believed her. Perhaps that made the pain worse. Because my daughter had not simply betrayed me. She had followed someone else, someone she trusted, someone who had used her. How bad are your finances? I asked. Tears immediately appeared. We owe more than I told you. How much? She looked away. Almost 300,000. I could barely speak. How? Business loans, credit cards, personal loans, and gambling. My head lifted. Gambling? She nodded. David started sports betting. The room became silent. He said he could fix everything. I felt suddenly exhausted. My jewelry, the house, the documents, now gambling. The man I had trusted with my daughter was falling apart, and he was taking her with him. Later that night, Grace called. I found something. What? There was an attorney. My heart raced. What attorney? A man named Charles Whitman. Related? I believe so. What did he do? He created several trusts during the 1960s. For who? She paused. Your family. I sat down. What does that mean? I don't know yet, but I know something else. What? There was a sealed amendment. An amendment. Yes. Where is it? No one knows. The words sent chills through me. A sealed amendment, hidden documents, my mother's warning, the compartment inside the brooch. Suddenly, Grace said something that changed everything. Lena, I think the document David wanted may actually be inside the brooch. I closed my eyes. My mother's voice returned. One day, it may save you. For decades, I had treated those words as sentiment. Now they felt literal. The following morning, Grace arrived carrying several folders. She placed them on my kitchen table. We're going to Chicago. I stared at her. What? We need to see Arthur Whitman. The collector. She nodded. If the compartment is still unopened, the answers may still be inside. My heart pounded. Chicago suddenly felt very close, very real. The missing brooch, the Whitman name, the hidden document, everything seemed to be leading there. As Grace prepared coffee, I looked through my kitchen window toward the maple tree Robert had planted years ago. For the first time since opening the empty jewelry box, I felt something stronger than grief. Hope. Because somewhere inside a gold brooch my mother had protected her entire life, there might finally be an answer. And whatever David Bennett had been searching for, I intended to find it first. 2 days later, Grace and I boarded a morning flight to Chicago. At 68 years old, I never imagined I would be chasing family secrets across the country because of a stolen brooch. The entire situation felt unreal. As our plane rose above Columbus, I looked down at the city where I had spent nearly my entire life. My house, Robert's garden, the maple tree, the empty jewelry box. Everything seemed very far away. Grace sat beside me reviewing several documents. She had become completely invested in the mystery. "You're nervous," she said. "I don't know what we're going to find." "Neither do I." I looked out the window. "What if there's nothing?" She folded the papers carefully. "Then we go home." "And if there is something," Grace smiled, "then your mother knew exactly what she was doing." Arthur Whitman's Antique Gallery occupied a renovated brick building on the north side of Chicago. Large windows displayed antique clocks, paintings, silver collections, and furniture. The place looked more like a museum than a store. As we entered, an elderly man wearing a gray suit approached us. He appeared to be in his 70s, tall, thin, white hair, sharp blue eyes. "Mrs. Gomez?" I blinked. "You know who I am." He smiled. "Franklin Pawn called me." I looked at Grace. The pawn shop owner had contacted him. Arthur extended his hand. "I've been expecting you." He led us into a private office. The room smelled of old books and polished wood. Antique clocks lined the walls. Several display cases held historical objects. On the desk sat a small black box. My heart immediately began racing. Arthur noticed. "Yes," he said softly. "It's your mother's brooch." For several seconds, I could not move. After weeks of uncertainty, there it was. The little gold flower. Exactly as I remembered. Arthur carefully opened the box. The brooch rested on black velvet. Tears filled my eyes. I reached toward it. My mother's fingers had touched it. My grandmother's fingers, now mine. I never thought I'd see it again. Arthur studied me carefully. "Your daughter sold it." I nodded. "I'm sorry." Grace leaned forward. "You believed there was a compartment." Arthur nodded. "Yes." He removed a magnifying glass. "The craftsmanship is unusual." He turned the brooch over. Near the clasp was a tiny indentation almost impossible to see. "I've dealt with antique jewelry for 40 years. He smiled slightly. "People hide things." My heart pounded. "Did you open it?" "No." "Why not?" He looked directly at me. "Because some objects belong to families." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because of the brooch, because of the kindness so many people in recent weeks had taken, Arthur had chosen to protect. He handed me a pair of white gloves. "I think you should open it." My hands trembled. The room became completely silent. I remembered my mother's voice. "One day, it may save you." Very carefully, I examined the tiny indentation. Arthur provided a small tool. The metal clicked softly. Nothing happened. I tried again. A faint sound. Then the back of the brooch shifted. Grace leaned forward. Arthur remained silent. Very slowly, a hidden compartment opened. Inside rested a tightly folded piece of paper. No jewelry, no money, only paper. For several seconds, nobody moved. I carefully removed it. The paper had yellowed with age. My mother's handwriting appeared on the outside. "For Lena." My breathing became shallow. I unfolded it. Inside was another folded document, a legal document, several signatures, multiple pages. Grace immediately recognized it. "Oh my God. What?" She took the papers. "This is a trust amendment." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" Arthur remained quiet. Grace carefully read the first page. "The Whitman Family Trust." My hands began shaking. Whitman. Again. The name connected everything. "The date?" I asked. 1964. She continued reading. Then suddenly she stopped. "What?" Grace looked directly at me. "Lena, your mother was a beneficiary." I felt dizzy. "What?" "Your mother inherited an interest." "In what?" She continued reading. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it. Finally, she spoke. "The property." "What property?" "The Whitman property." I sat back in my chair. The photograph, the attic, the note, everything suddenly became real. "But where is it?" Grace continued reading. Then her expression changed. "What?" She looked at me carefully. "This may involve your house." The room became silent. Arthur slowly removed his glasses. I felt cold. "My house?" "The trust transferred certain rights." "What rights?" Grace read further. Her eyes widened. "There are restrictions." "What kind?" "The property cannot be sold under pressure." I stared at her. "What?" She continued. "The beneficiary shall maintain lifetime occupancy rights." Arthur nodded slowly. Grace looked up. "Lena, this document protects you?" My eyes filled with tears. My mother. My entire life, I believed she had simply given me a brooch. Instead, she had hidden protection. Protection from what, or from whom? Suddenly, Grace found another page. She became very quiet. "What is it?" She read carefully. "The secondary beneficiary." My stomach tightened. "Who?" "Caroline." I felt tears forming. "My daughter," Grace nodded. "She inherits after your death." Relief flooded me. Then Grace kept reading, and her face changed again. "What?" She swallowed. "There are conditions." "What conditions?" She looked directly at me. "The inheritance becomes void if the secondary beneficiary attempts to force the primary beneficiary from the property." Nobody spoke. Arthur sat quietly. I felt unable to breathe. Force, pressure, sell the house, move out, nursing home. David. Everything. Every conversation. Every suggestion. Every argument. My eyes filled completely. My mother had known. Perhaps not David specifically. But she had understood something about people. About greed. About family. About vulnerability. Arthur finally spoke. "Your mother was very wise." I nodded silently. Grace continued examining the papers. "There are additional legal protections." "For what?" "The property cannot be transferred without your consent." I closed my eyes. For weeks, I had felt helpless, old, alone, betrayed. Now, sitting in a quiet office in Chicago, I realized something. I was protected. My mother had protected me decades ago. Not with money, not with jewelry, with foresight. Arthur carefully returned the brooch to the box. Mrs. Gomez, I believe it belongs with you. I looked up. What about the purchase? He smiled. I paid $400. I immediately reached for my purse. He raised his hand. No. I stared at him. You don't have to. Your mother intended for you to have it. Tears finally rolled down my cheeks. In recent weeks, I had seen greed, manipulation, lies, and now I was seeing generosity. Before we left, Grace placed the documents carefully inside her briefcase. We'll make copies. I nodded. And then, she looked directly at me. Then we go home. I understood exactly what she meant. Because waiting in Ohio was David Bennett. And for the first time since my jewelry disappeared, I finally possessed the one thing he had been searching for. The truth. The flight back to Columbus felt completely different from the flight to Chicago. When Grace and I had left Ohio, we were carrying questions. Now we were carrying answers. The brooch rested inside my purse. The trust documents sat safely inside Grace's briefcase. And somewhere between Chicago and Columbus, I finally understood why my mother had never explained everything. She had not hidden the truth because she distrusted me. She had hidden it because she understood human nature. People change when money appears. Families change. Marriages change. Children change. As the plane descended, Grace looked at me. What are you going to do? I stared out the window. I don't know. You do know. I looked at her. She smiled gently. You've known since Chicago. Perhaps she was right, because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. I wasn't grieving. I was angry. Not because of the jewelry anymore, not because of the money, but because David had entered my life believing that age made me weak. He believed I would surrender. He believed I would sell my home. He believed he could pressure me. And perhaps worst of all, he had used my daughter. The following morning, I called Carolyn. Can you come over tonight? Her voice sounded nervous. Just me? No. Silence. You want David too? Yes. She hesitated. Okay. After hanging up, I spent several hours cleaning the house. Not because it needed cleaning, because I needed something to do. I dusted Robert's photographs, watered the plants, folded blankets, straightened books. The house felt different now, no longer vulnerable, protected. My mother had protected it long before I even understood that protection was necessary. Around 5 o'clock, Grace arrived. She carried copies of every document. Are you sure you want me here? Yes. She nodded. I'll stay quiet unless necessary. At 6:30, David's truck pulled into the driveway. Caroline entered first. She looked frightened. David followed. He appeared irritated, as if this meeting were an inconvenience. I invited them into the living room, the same room where they had admitted selling my jewelry, the same room where my family had celebrated Christmas for decades. Nobody spoke. Finally, David looked at Grace. Why is she here? Grace smiled politely. I'm a friend. He frowned. I think this should stay private. I spoke calmly. It stopped being private when you searched my house. His face hardened. I told you. No. I interrupted him. Tonight, you listen. He leaned back in his chair. Caroline looked down at her hands. I placed the gold brooch on the coffee table. The room became completely silent. Caroline gasped. "You found it!" I nodded. David stared at it. For the first time, I saw genuine emotion in his face. Not sadness, not relief, fear. His eyes never left the brooch. "Where did you get it?" he asked. "Chicago?" His expression changed. He understood immediately. He knew. I looked directly at him. "You knew there was something inside." "No." "Stop lying." "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened my purse and removed the trust documents. Grace remained silent. Caroline looked confused. David became very pale. I placed the papers beside the brooch. "You searched my office." "No." "You searched my files." "No." "You hired an investigator." He looked toward Caroline. She began crying. "I told her." His jaw tightened. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then I asked the question that had been waiting for weeks. "What were you looking for?" He looked away. "Nothing." I opened the documents. "The Whitman Family Trust." His eyes lifted immediately. There it was. Recognition. The truth. Caroline saw it too. "David?" He said nothing. "You knew." He remained silent. I felt strangely calm. "How long?" His shoulders dropped. Finally, after weeks of lies, after my jewelry, after my mother's secrets, after my daughter's tears, he finally spoke. "About 6 months." Caroline looked at him. "What?" He rubbed his forehead. "One of my clients told me." "What client?" "A real estate investor." I said nothing. He said older neighborhoods sometimes have unresolved family trusts. Grace spoke for the first time. "So you researched Lena's family." He looked at her. "I was desperate." "That isn't an answer." His voice became louder. "My business was collapsing." Caroline stared at him. "You told me it was temporary." "It was." "You told me the gambling stopped." He looked away. She began crying. "You lied." The room felt heavy. Years of secrets were suddenly collapsing. David finally looked at me. I thought there might be money. Inside the brooch. Or documents. And if you found them. He didn't answer. I already knew. He would have used them, sold them, pressured me. Anything to escape his debts. Caroline stood up. "You used me." His head lifted. "No. You made me steal from my mother." His voice rose. "We needed help." "No." Tears rolled down her face. "You needed help." For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw my daughter returning. Not the frightened wife. Not the woman repeating her husband's excuses. My daughter. David stood. "I did this for us." Caroline shook her head. "You did this for yourself." Silence. Long silence. Finally, I opened the trust document. "There are conditions." David stared at me. "The property cannot be sold without my consent." His face remained blank. I continued. "The secondary beneficiary loses the inheritance if they pressure the primary beneficiary." Caroline looked confused. "What does that mean?" I looked at her. "It means you inherit this house after I die." She covered her mouth. "And if someone tries to force me out?" Her eyes widened. "No." I nodded slowly. She looked toward David. The truth struck her immediately. He had wanted the house, the sale, the money, everything. David sat down heavily. For the first time, he looked defeated. Not angry, not defensive, defeated. He whispered something. I didn't think it would go this far. Caroline looked at him. It already did. Grace quietly gathered the papers. Nobody moved. The clock ticked. The house remained silent. And then David asked the question that surprised me most. What happens now? I looked at him. For weeks I had imagined this moment. Anger, revenge, justice. But sitting in my living room, looking at a broken man and my crying daughter, I realized something. The truth itself was punishment. He had lost. Not because of money, not because of legal documents, because greed had taken everything from him. His wife's trust, my respect, his own dignity. I stood up. What happens now is that you leave my house. He nodded slowly. Caroline began crying again. David walked toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back at the brooch. The object he had chased. The secret he had wanted. The answer he had nearly destroyed my family trying to find. And then he walked out. The front door closed. The house became quiet. My daughter sat alone on the sofa, and for the first time in weeks, neither of us knew what to say. The morning after David left my house, I woke up to complete silence. No phone calls, no text messages, no arguments. For the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. Yet underneath that calm was something else. The feeling that nothing had truly ended. David had walked away. But men like David rarely accepted defeat quietly. I made coffee and sat beside the kitchen window where Robert used to read the newspaper every morning. The gold brooch rested beside my cup. I touched it gently. My mother's final protection. For nearly 60 years, she had carried this secret. And somehow, she had known that one day I would need it. Around 10 o'clock, Caroline called. Her voice sounded exhausted. Mom? Yes. I didn't go home. I remained quiet. Where are you? At a hotel. My heart ached. Are you alone? Yes. There was a long silence. Finally, she whispered, I don't think I know my husband anymore. I closed my eyes. For weeks, I had focused on my own pain. The jewelry, the betrayal, the lies. But now, I heard something else. My daughter's heart breaking. Has David called you? All night. And he says everyone is overreacting. I wasn't surprised. People who justify their actions often believe everyone else is emotional. What do you want to do? I asked. She began crying. I don't know. Then don't decide today. For several seconds, she said nothing. Can I come over later? I hesitated, not because I wanted to punish her, because trust had become fragile. Finally, I answered. Yes. That afternoon, Grace arrived carrying additional copies of the trust documents. She spread everything across my dining room table. There are several important sections. I sat beside her. The occupancy rights are clear. What does that mean exactly? No one can force you to sell. I understand that. She adjusted her glasses. But there is something else. What? She handed me one page. The legal language was complicated. I looked up. What does it say? Grace folded her hands. Your mother anticipated outside pressure. I frowned. What do you mean? She specifically wrote that no spouse creditor or third party could influence the property transfer. My heart skipped. Spouse. Creditor. Third party. It was as though my mother had somehow predicted David. Of course she hadn't, but she had understood human weakness. Money. Debt. Greed. At 4:00, Caroline arrived. She looked terrible. Her eyes were swollen. She carried only a small overnight bag. Grace quietly excused herself and moved into the kitchen. For several moments, Caroline simply stood in the living room. Finally, she saw the brooch. Tears immediately appeared. You got it back. I nodded. She sat beside me. I'm sorry. I looked at her. This was not the defensive daughter from weeks earlier. This was my little girl, the child Robert had carried after falling from her bicycle, the teenager who cried after her first heartbreak, the woman who had become lost. I know. She covered her face. I can't believe I did that. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, she whispered, He kept saying we could fix everything. What exactly did he tell you? He said your mother probably left money. And you believed him. She nodded. I was scared. About what? She finally told me everything. The business debts, the unpaid loans, the credit cards, the gambling, the collectors. Several payments had already been missed. One lender had threatened legal action. David had become obsessed with money, obsessed with the house, obsessed with family history. He said there had to be something. I looked at her. And if there wasn't? She began crying again. He said we'd lose everything. For the first time, I truly understood. David had not simply manipulated her. He had frightened her. Fear makes people justify terrible decisions. That still didn't excuse what she had done, but it explained it. As evening approached, the three of us sat at the dining room table. Grace carefully explained the trust. Caroline listened quietly. When Grace reached the inheritance condition, Caroline began crying. I almost lost everything. I reached across the table. No. She looked up. You almost lost yourself. She lowered her head. Around 7:00, the doorbell rang. Nobody had been expecting anyone. I walked to the front door. David stood outside. His appearance shocked me. He looked exhausted. His clothes were wrinkled. His eyes were red. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I need to talk to Caroline. She's busy. I know she's here. Behind me, Caroline had entered the hallway. Their eyes met. Years of marriage stood between them. Years of promises. Years of lies. David looked at her. Please. She crossed her arms. What do you want? He stepped inside. I made mistakes. Grace appeared beside me. David immediately noticed her. He looked uncomfortable. Caroline remained silent. I was trying to save us. No, she answered quietly. You were trying to save yourself. He looked wounded. That's not fair. She laughed softly through tears. You made me steal from my own mother. He looked down. I thought there was money. The house, the trust. She stared at him. So you knew. He said nothing, and silence became his confession. He finally looked at me. I never meant to hurt you. I answered honestly. But you did. He nodded. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then David said something unexpected. I found another buyer for the house. The room froze. Grace slowly removed her glasses. Caroline stared at him. What? He looked nervous. I only asked. You what? Caroline shouted. He stepped backward. I never signed anything. My heart began racing. You showed my house. He swallowed. Only once. I felt physically sick. While I sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, he had brought strangers into my home. The moving boxes, the visitors, the cars Helen had seen. Everything suddenly made sense. Caroline looked horrified. Oh my God. David lowered his head. I thought if we sold... No. Her voice broke. You planned this. He looked at her. No. You planned everything. The room became completely silent. At that moment, I realized this wasn't simply about money anymore. This was about trust, and trust had collapsed. David looked around the room. The brooch, the documents, Grace, Caroline, me. Everything he had pursued was sitting directly in front of him, and he had lost all of it. Finally, he spoke quietly. I think I should leave. Nobody stopped him. He walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he looked at Caroline. I love you. She wiped her tears. I don't know who you are. The front door closed, and this time, unlike the previous night, none of us expected him to return. Grace looked at me. You realize this isn't over. I nodded, because for the first time, Caroline herself had finally seen the truth. And sometimes the most painful moment in a marriage is not discovering a lie. It's discovering that the person you trusted has been slowly disappearing for years. The next morning, Caroline was still sleeping in my guest room. It felt strange seeing her there again. For years after she married David, that room had become a place for holiday visits, birthdays, and occasional weekends. Now my daughter was sleeping beneath my roof because her marriage was falling apart. I stood outside the door for several moments before quietly walking downstairs. The house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but honest. For weeks, we had all been living inside lies. Now the truth sat openly between us. The brooch rested in my bedroom drawer. The trust documents were locked safely inside my office, and David Bennett no longer had access to either. Around 8 o'clock, Grace called. How are you holding up? I don't know. She laughed softly. That's the correct answer. I poured coffee. What happens now? Legally, emotionally. Grace became quiet. Those are usually harder. After hanging up, I sat alone at the kitchen table. For the first time in weeks, I thought about Robert. What would he have done? He had always possessed a calmness I lacked. During difficult times, he would sit quietly for hours before making decisions. I could almost hear his voice. Don't rush. By mid-morning, Caroline came downstairs. She looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. For sleeping. For everything. I handed her a cup of coffee. She sat across from me. For several minutes, we watched the birds outside. Finally, she spoke. I don't know what to do. About David? She nodded. I still love him. I wasn't surprised. Love doesn't disappear because truth appears. Sometimes love survives long after trust dies. Do you want to go back? Tears filled her eyes. I don't know who I'd be going back to. That answer hurt, because I realized she was grieving too. Not only her marriage, the man she thought she married. Around noon, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. David. She didn't answer. 5 minutes later, he called again and again. Finally, she turned the phone over. He says he wants to explain. What explanation is left? She looked down. He says he never meant for things to go this far. I thought about those words. Nobody plans destruction. People simply make one selfish decision, then another, until suddenly they stand inside ruins. That afternoon, I decided to visit Robert's grave. I hadn't gone in several months. Caroline asked if she could come. The cemetery sat on the edge of Columbus beneath large oak trees. Robert had loved that place. He once told me it felt peaceful. As we stood beside his headstone, neither of us spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees. Caroline suddenly began crying. "I'm sorry, Dad." I felt my own tears appear. She knelt beside the grave. "I failed Mom." "No," I whispered. She looked up. "I did." I shook my head. "You made a terrible decision." She wiped her eyes. "That's the same thing." "No." I sat beside her. "A bad decision isn't the same as being a bad person." She cried harder. For years, I had imagined my daughter becoming stronger with age. Instead, life had frightened her. Debt, marriage, pressure, fear. Perhaps we never stop being vulnerable, even as adults. As we walked back toward the car, Caroline suddenly asked, "Do you think Dad would forgive me?" I looked toward Robert's headstone. Immediately. She cried all the way home. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived, Helen, my neighbor. She carried a casserole dish. "I heard Caroline's car." News traveled quickly in our neighborhood. We sat together in the kitchen. Helen looked at Caroline. "I made mistakes too." Caroline smiled weakly. "What kind?" Helen laughed. "The expensive kind." Even I smiled. For the next hour, Helen told stories about her own marriage, financial troubles, arguments, pride, forgiveness. Some marriages survived, some didn't. But one sentence stayed with Caroline. "You can't fix someone who refuses to see the truth." After Helen left, Caroline remained quiet. Around 7 o'clock, her phone rang again. This time she answered. I couldn't hear David's voice, only hers. "No." Silence. "No." More silence. Finally, "I'm staying with my mother." Her voice became stronger. "No, David." Another pause. Then, "The house was never yours." She hung up. Her hands trembled. "What did he say?" She looked at me. "He wants me to convince you to sell. Even now. Even after everything. The house. Always the house." Something inside me finally settled. Because until that moment, a small part of me had wondered if David truly understood what he had done. Now I knew. He still didn't. Caroline went upstairs shortly afterward. I remained alone in the living room. The same room where Robert and I had celebrated anniversaries. The same room where Caroline opened Christmas presents. The same room where David had searched for answers that were never his. I walked upstairs and removed the brooch from my drawer. The gold flower shone beneath the bedroom lamp. I thought about my mother. How many times had she held it? How many times had she worried? How many years had she carried this burden alone? Suddenly, I understood something. The trust wasn't really about money, or property, or inheritance. It was about dignity, about allowing a woman to remain secure in her own home, about protecting her from pressure, from greed, from fear. My mother had lived through difficult years. Perhaps she had seen relatives fight over money. Perhaps she had watched widows lose homes. Perhaps she understood exactly what could happen. And so she protected me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Caroline stood in the doorway. "Can I sit?" I nodded. She sat beside me on the bed. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at the brooch. "Grandma saved you." I smiled sadly. She did. Tears appeared again. "I almost destroyed everything." I took her hand. "No." She looked at me. "You stopped before it was too late." She cried quietly. "I don't know if you'll ever trust me again." I thought carefully before answering. Trust does not return quickly. Not after betrayal. Not after lies. But love is different. Love sometimes survives while trust heals. "I don't know either," she nodded. "But I want to try." That night, after she went to bed, I stood at my bedroom window. The maple tree moved gently in the darkness. Robert had planted it when Caroline turned 5. He said it would grow as our family grew. Families, I realized, are not destroyed by one storm. They bend, they break, they heal. And somewhere downstairs, my daughter was beginning to find her way back. But I also knew another truth. David Bennett was not finished. And before this story ended, one final decision would determine whether my family could truly heal. 3 days passed without hearing from David. The silence itself felt unusual. For nearly a month, every morning had brought another argument, another revelation, another painful discovery. Now the house had become quiet again. Caroline remained in the guest room. She spent hours searching for jobs, reviewing financial statements, and speaking with her attorney. Some days, she cried. Other days, she sat silently on the back porch, staring at the maple tree Robert had planted. Neither of us knew exactly what the future would look like, but for the first time, we were facing it honestly. On Thursday morning, my phone rang. It was Grace. "Lena, are you sitting down?" My stomach tightened. "Why, I received a call from David's attorney." I felt cold. "What does he want?" "He wants a meeting." "Absolutely not." "That's what I told him." I walked toward the kitchen window. "What else?" Grace hesitated. "He says David wants to apologize." I almost laughed. "Through a lawyer." "He also wants to discuss the trust." That sentence immediately changed my mood. "What about it?" "He claims he misunderstood the documents." I closed my eyes. For weeks, David had searched my house, investigated my family, sold my jewelry, and pressured me to sell my home. Now he misunderstood. Grace spoke again. "I think he's scared." "Of what?" "The debts." That afternoon, Caroline received several phone calls. Collection agencies, banks, credit card companies. The financial situation was even worse than either of us had realized. By evening, she sat at my kitchen table with tears running down her face. "He lied about everything." I sat beside her. "How much?" She handed me several papers. The total debt exceeded $350,000. Business loans, personal loans, credit cards, sports betting accounts, private lenders. I looked up. "Did you know?" She shook her head. "I knew about some. But not all." "No." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, He was drowning. Yes. And he tried to pull everyone else down with him. I looked at my daughter. She had finally reached the painful place where truth lives. Not anger, not denial, acceptance. The next day, Grace arranged a meeting at her office. Present would be Grace, myself, David, and his attorney. Caroline chose not to attend. I can't look at him right now. I understood. At 2:00 Friday afternoon, I entered Grace's conference room. David sat beside a middle-aged attorney named Michael Reeves. David looked older. Only a few weeks had passed, yet he seemed to have aged years. His confidence had disappeared. His expensive watch was gone. His wedding ring remained. The attorney spoke first. Mr. Bennett wishes to apologize. David looked directly at me. I'm sorry. The room remained silent. I made terrible decisions. I said nothing. I was desperate. Still silence. He lowered his head. I thought if I found something I could fix everything. Grace folded her hands. And if you had found the documents? He didn't answer. The attorney intervened. My client understands his actions were inappropriate. Inappropriate? What a small word. Selling my wedding ring, searching my home, manipulating my daughter, trying to sell my house. Inappropriate. I finally spoke. Why did you continue? David looked up. What? You discovered nothing. You kept searching. You pressured Caroline. You showed my house. His eyes filled slightly. I couldn't stop. For the first time, his answer sounded honest. Not because it excused him, because addiction often removes reason. Debt had become panic. Panic had become obsession. Obsession had become destruction. Grace asked quietly, Are you still gambling? David stared at the table. No. The attorney looked uncomfortable. Finally, David whispered, I lost everything. The room became silent. What does that mean? I asked. The company. The truck. The savings. I thought about the man who had entered my house speaking about real estate values, about market opportunities, about my future. Now he sat broken. Not because of the trust, because of his own choices. His attorney slid several papers across the table. Mr. Bennett has signed separation documents. I looked at David. He nodded. I don't want Caroline carrying my debt. For the first time in weeks, I saw something different. Responsibility. Late, painful, but real. I love her, he said quietly. I believed him. Love had never been the problem. Fear was. Greed was. Pride was. People sometimes destroy the people they love while trying to save themselves. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As I stood to leave, David spoke one final time. Lena. I turned. He looked exhausted. I really did love your daughter. I nodded. I know. And I never meant to hurt you. For several seconds, I looked at him. The man who had stolen my trust. The man who had nearly destroyed my family. The man who sat defeated before me. I believe you. His eyes filled with tears. But intentions don't repair damage. He nodded. I know. When I returned home, Caroline waited in the kitchen. How was it? I sat beside her. He's letting you go. Tears immediately appeared. She looked down. I thought I'd feel relieved. What do you feel? Sad. I took her hand. You can be sad. That evening, we sat together on the back porch. The summer air felt cooler. The maple tree moved gently above us. For the first time in many years, Caroline rested her head on my shoulder, like she had done when she was 12. I'm scared. I know. What if I have to start over? I smiled softly. Then you start over. She looked at me. Did Grandma know all this would happen? I thought about my mother, the brooch, the hidden compartment, the trust, the protection. No. Then why did she do it? I looked toward the house, the windows, the porch, Robert's garden, the home we built. Because she understood that women sometimes need protection. Caroline cried quietly. I almost lost this house. I squeezed her hand. No. You almost lost yourself. The stars slowly appeared above us. Inside the house, my mother's brooch rested safely once again. Robert's photographs still lined the hallway. The trust had protected me, but something even more important had happened. My daughter had finally come home. And as I looked at her sitting beside me beneath the tree her father planted, I realized that healing had finally begun. Winter arrived quietly that year. The maple tree Robert had planted stood bare outside the living room window, its branches reaching toward the gray Ohio sky. Snow occasionally covered the yard, and for the first time in many months, my house felt peaceful. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because the lies had. Nearly 6 months had passed since I opened the empty jewelry box. 6 months since my daughter sold my mother's jewelry. 6 months since I discovered that my own family had been standing on the edge of destruction. Life, however, has a way of continuing. Caroline rented a small apartment only 10 minutes from my house. The divorce proceedings had begun. David's construction business officially closed. Several debts were settled through bankruptcy arrangements. And although I rarely heard his name anymore, I sometimes wondered how a good man could slowly become a stranger. Perhaps none of us change all at once. Perhaps we lose ourselves one decision at a time. Caroline found work at a local insurance agency. The salary was lower than before, but she no longer hid credit card bills or collection notices. She attended counseling every week. Sometimes she invited me to join her. At first I refused. I wasn't ready. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Eventually, however, I agreed. The counselor asked me a simple question. What did you lose? I answered immediately. My jewelry. She smiled gently. What else? I sat quietly. Finally, I said the truth. I lost my certainty. For most of my life, I believed my daughter would always protect me. I believed family automatically meant safety. I believed love prevented betrayal. But life had taught me otherwise. Trust requires care. Love requires boundaries. And family members must still be responsible for their choices. One snowy afternoon, Caroline arrived carrying a small package. She looked nervous. What is it? I asked. She placed the box on my kitchen table. I found it. Inside lay my mother's pearl necklace. I stared at it. The same pearls, the same clasp, the same tiny imperfections. Tears immediately filled my eyes. How? I tracked down the buyer. She smiled weakly. I bought it back. I touched the necklace carefully. For several moments, neither of us spoke. It won't fix everything, she said. No, I know. but I wanted to try. Over the following months, she located several additional pieces. The bracelet, one pair of earrings. Not everything returned. Robert's wedding ring had disappeared. No records existed. The buyer could not be found. For a long time, that loss hurt the most. Until one day, I visited Robert's grave. As I stood beside his headstone, I suddenly realized something. His ring had never been our marriage. I had spent years believing the object contained the love, but the love had always remained inside me. I no longer needed the ring to remember him. That realization brought peace. Spring eventually returned. The maple tree blossomed. Flowers appeared in the garden. The house once again smelled of open windows and fresh air. One Saturday afternoon, Caroline helped me clean the attic. The same attic where I had found my mother's letters. We sat among old boxes and family photographs. She picked up the picture of my mother beside the Whitman property. She saved all of us. I smiled. She did. Do you think Grandma knew this would happen? I looked at the photograph. No. Then why did she protect the house? I thought carefully, because the answer had changed. When I first discovered the trust, I believed my mother had protected the property. Now I understood something different. She had protected my independence. She had protected my dignity. She had protected my right to make my own decisions. And perhaps that was the greatest gift one woman could leave another. A few weeks later, Grace joined us for dinner. As always, she brought pie. She looked around the dining room. It's nice seeing laughter in this house again. Caroline smiled. We're working on it. Grace raised her glass. To strong women. We all laughed. After dinner, Caroline handed me another small box. What now? I asked. She smiled. Open it. Inside rested the gold brooch. My mother's brooch. The same little flower. The same hidden compartment. The same secret. I had it professionally restored. I gently touched the gold. For a moment, I could almost hear my mother's voice. One day it may save you. She had been right. Not because of money, not because of legal document, because the brooch reminded me of something far more important. A woman should never surrender her voice. She should never surrender her home. And she should never surrender herself simply to keep peace within a family. That evening, Caroline and I sat together on the front porch. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Birds settled into the branches. The neighborhood grew quiet. For the first time in many years, my daughter rested her head against my shoulder. I'm sorry, she whispered. I looked at her. I know. Will you ever trust me again? The question remained difficult. I thought about the empty jewelry box, the pawn shop, Chicago, the documents, the tears, the months of healing. Finally, I answered honestly. Trust grows back. She nodded, slowly, very slowly. She smiled through tears. I can wait. I placed my hand over hers, because healing is not one conversation, not one apology, not one act. Healing is choosing each day to remain. And as the evening light faded across the front yard, I realized something. My daughter had sold my jewelry. But in losing those objects, we had uncovered truths buried for generations. My mother's wisdom, my own strength, and my daughter's chance to become herself again. Everything had changed. Not because of the jewelry, but because the truth finally came home.